Be a test for you this morning because there's no PowerPoint to keep you awake, all right? Just in case you thought it was because the media stuff had broken. It's not. It's because there isn't one. So this morning we carry on in this series that we're doing through the Gospel of Mark, and we get to Mark chapter 5, and I want to talk a little bit this morning about shame. About shame. I think it's a concept that we're probably all familiar with in one way or another. At one time or another, I'm sure we've experienced a sense of shame. I know I have. I'm sure you're probably thinking, yeah, I bet you have. You know, those moments where you sort of think, oh, I wish the ground would just open up and swallow me. Or the moments when you think about something that you've done or you've said and something inside of you twists and goes, oh, I can remember, it was horrible. It was terrible, that sense of shame. We all know it. And I think it's something that's quite well understood within our society today. You know, there are headlines, aren't there, about people being shamed. You know, when there was the football, I mentioned the football. It's a good morning, isn't it, if you're a Norwich City supporter this morning. But I won't go into that too much, but just look at the tables. Anyway, people at the football who were taunting racial abuse at some of the players. And there was lots of stuff in the headlines about these people being identified. They needed to be named and shamed for what they had done. There is talk about shame on those who evade tax, you know, the shame of being found out that you've evaded paying tax. The shame that falls upon the church with regards to the sex abuse scandals. Not only that it happens, but that it's then hidden completely, covered up. And there is a sense of shame, and rightly so, about that. The shame that people have spoken about, that in our day and in our country, there are people who, despite having jobs, rely on a food bank to be able to feed their families because they have not got enough. We understand shame, I think. Society understands shame. It's a part of the human condition, I think. Unfortunately, it's part of the human condition. We go back to Genesis, which we seem to be referring to quite often in these sermon series, and I think it's really because Jesus talks so much about the kingdom that when we go right back to when God created the world, we see how it was supposed to be when we lived fully within the kingdom of God. We lived acknowledging the rule and the reign of the king. And back in Genesis 2:29, we hear that the man and the woman, Adam and Eve, are naked, but they feel no shame. They're exposed completely in a position of vulnerability, but they feel no shame. But in Genesis 3:10, when they've done what they know they shouldn't have done, and God comes for a walk in the garden to see them, we hear, as he says, where are you, that they say, well, actually, I was afraid, I was naked, and I hid. That's what shame does. It exposes you, it makes you fearful, and so you hide. That's what shame does. It brings this feeling of complete exposure and nakedness and dishonour and unworthiness, and we'll have all felt a bit of that at some time, or we will have been prey to it. I think it can be self-created. It can be because we've done something we know we shouldn't have done and we're ashamed of it. Sometimes it happens through victimisation, I think, as well. People can be shamed because they're different. People can be shamed because people can't cope with them. They push them out a little bit. And let's not kid ourselves that we are free from anything to do with shame within the church. Let's not kid ourselves for a moment that the church is a place where people can come and feel no shame. Because I would want to suggest to you this morning that I think it can be worse at times within a church setting. Far worse within a church setting. Why? Because wherever there is an increase in perfectionism or in doing things a certain right way, I think there will always be an increasing capacity for shame. Because when we don't live up to the supposed standards of behaviour or etiquette, when we do things that we know fall way below what is commonly acceptable by these groups of people, then we will know shame. And sometimes if no one else knows it, we do. And we will try and hide it. We'll try and conceal it. It happens all the time in churches, I think. I think we're brilliant at hiding things like this. And we try and cover it up. And when this happens, you see, we can never truly give ourselves to one another, not in the true freedom of relationship, of friendship, never truly live out the reality of what it is to be brothers and sisters in Christ, because we have this sense of shame that we know over the truth and the reality of who we are and of our perceived failings or shortcomings. I think shame is prevalent within the church. I really do. Because we fear being honest. We think if people really knew the things that I harbour in my heart, if people really knew the things that I think about, if people really knew the stuff that I'm really addicted to, I couldn't let them know. I would be so ashamed. Shame binds people. It binds those who are considered to be a bit beyond the pale, and it binds those who are understood to be a bit insignificant, maybe. And sin and guilt, you see, sin and guilt might not be a trendy thing to talk about nowadays, but I think most people outside of the church understand something of shame. I think we understand, and I will identify with the whole idea of what shame is. And as I've been thinking about this, I wonder, is this a good way for us to talk and share about the gospel, the good news? The good news is that just as God covered the shame of Adam and Eve in the garden, because he did, when they said, I was naked, I was afraid and I hid, he didn't say build a wall and get over it, did he? He covered them. He covered their shame. And in covering their shame, something had to die, because he covered them with an animal skin. Something died so that God could cover the shame of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. Just as God covers the shame of Adam and Eve in the garden, there is one who for us, for you and me, has taken our shame. He took it outside the city walls into a place of shame, and he took it to a cross, a cursed death of shame, so that we might know not just a covering up of our shame, but a release of it. He takes it away. The person and the presence and the power of Jesus makes it possible for shame to be dealt with, not just covered up, but dealt with, for it to be removed, because he pays the price. He picks up the bill. And shame, I think, I wanted to talk about it because I think shame in this chapter really kind of controls the lives of two of the people that we encounter, that Jesus encounters within this chapter. This Jesus who we read in verse 1 of chapter 5 sets off across the lake to the region of the Gerasenes. Now this was a territory to the southeast of the Sea of Galilee, and it's a place that had never really been a Jewish territory, and it was also known as the Decapolis, 10 towns, even though if you look in commentaries that it's difficult for them to tell you exactly which 10 towns they were. There obviously were 10 towns kind of around there that they grouped together and said, hey, that's the Decapolis. There is discussion as to exactly where this story takes place in that region of the Gerasenes. Some people say it's Gerasa or Gergasa or Gadara. You get the reason why it's called the Gerasenes, because it all begins with a G, it seems to me. But I think it could possibly be Gadara that is the place. It's a place that looks out over the sea, where there were caves that were hewn out of rock that were used as tombs. And it was also the place that was home to the Roman 10th Legion. And they had as a symbol on their military standard a wild boar, hence the pigs. It's quite likely that it was this place. And so Jesus is here journeying from the Orthodox Jewish territory into uncharted Gentile territory. Here is Jesus pioneering, really, reaching out into what would have been seen as the pagan world. And let's remember that the storm that we read about at the end of chapter 4 last week occurs on this journey. Almost as if this push into new territory stirs up resistance. It stirs up resistance before he's even landed, because the storm happens on the way over. And I just wonder whether this man who Jesus encounters with this unclean spirit, whether he'd witnessed the storm, whether he'd seen it being calmed. He's there living among the tombs that would have looked out onto the sea. Did he see it? Did he see this almighty hellish storm and then realise that there was this person who spoke and it stilled? Had he witnessed that? Who knows? But what we do know is this. When Jesus sets foot on land, he is met by this bloke, this crazed, naked man who appears from the tombs, who is covered in wounds that I would imagine are festering, because I doubt he cuts himself with anything that's clean. And he comes to meet Jesus, screaming at the top of his voice, "Jesus, Son of God, what do you want to do with me? What are you going to do with me?" Now, I don't know about you, this welcome party of one, but I would have been back in the boat like lightning, wouldn't you? You step out, do you imagine it? The disciples, we were terrified of the storm. This is worse. We're getting in the boat and we're going away again. I would have been. I mean, you can't begin to imagine, can you, how frightening it must have been to have had this bloke screaming, naked, covering in wounds, coming at you in an aggressive way. You'd have been like, I think we'll go now. They obviously don't want us here, Jesus. But not Jesus. He stands and remains ready to meet this person, to welcome him. Not from a distance. He's not saying, get in the boat, we'll just put out a bit and I'll talk to him from out there. No, he stays where he is to welcome the welcome party. And the welcome party is this one bloke, this man who has been forced to live in the place of the dead, who has been bound hand and foot, who has been discarded from society, who has been deprived of human contact and care. A man who is overwhelmed with legions beyond his control, who is locked into the shame of his condition. He isn't even clothed. He's withdrawn from life. He's locked away in caves. He's chained. He's bound by shame. He cuts himself. He's self-harming in a terrible way. Who knows why? Maybe he's just trying to let the pain out. If he can physically feel the pain, maybe emotionally there might be some release. Or is he just trying to mark his body in the way that he knows his community has marked and scarred his very being? Who knows? But he has been cut off from hope and future and the whole society. And we are told that he tore the chains apart. No one can subdue him. Night and day, he cries out. So he's aggressive. I think shame can do that. I think you can bully others to cover your own shame. I think shame can make you a bit like a cornered animal, you know. It forces us into a position of complete withdrawal or attack, depending on how we might feel. Do you know, there is so much shame in here, in who this man is, and in how he has been treated. It is a hopeless situation. And as I read it, I feel so incredibly challenged by it. And there's a voice in my head that says, beware, take notice, because we all have the capacity to force others into life among the dead. We all have the capacity to cast those who are a bit difficult, who cannot be controlled, who we do not know what to do with, somewhere out there just away from us. Isn't that what we've always done? Isn't it? Heck, do you know, the best thing about working in an A&E department was the relationship with the local police force, because when you have people come into the department who are high on this and that, or have taken some heroin that's been cut with something wrong, and they're off on one, and they're wild, and they're stronger than you can even, the security people, you can't do anything with them, and they're chucking equipment around your resus room, and you're thinking, what am I going to do with them? When they're stable, you know you can ring the police, and the police take them away and put them in a cell. And you think, thank God. Thank God that there's someone that just takes them away and locks them up, because we don't know what to do with them. We can't control them. This is what we have done always. Isn't this why we sent people to Australia? It wasn't for a holiday, was it? They've done something wrong. We don't want that sort here. Let's send them the other side of the world. We shut people away historically who look different to us, who have physical disabilities, learning disabilities, people who are addicted, who we can't control. We shut them up. People who we think are shamed. The horror and the shame of what we have done to people years ago who had children out of wedlock. And what did? We locked them away somewhere. Shame on us. Shame on us, all of us. We do this, we've done it, and we continue to do it. And we do it in the church too. The people we can't cope with, we just say, well, I'm sorry, you don't meet the criteria. You don't fit the criteria for membership. Shame on us. And yet this Jesus, he stands on the shore of this pagan, fruitless, pathetic little piece of land that everybody would have thought was worthless. And he stays standing while this crazy madman comes running at him. Jesus, the person, he's seen here as he simply says, what's your name? Who are you? Who are you? The person of Jesus is seen here so clearly because he deals with individuals. He deals with the individual. And as the person of Jesus is seen here, so is the presence of Jesus. This Jesus has a presence. The man falls at the feet of Jesus. It's a position of complete humility. He comes under the authority of this Jesus because this Jesus is God. He's God. And yet the power of Jesus is displayed here too. Not just the person of Jesus, not just the presence of Jesus, the power of Jesus. Because this once tormented man ends up sitting dressed and in his right mind. His shame's been undone. He's free. The one thing that's always amused me in this story is the fact that those who were tending the pigs then run to tell the people in the town what's happened. This makes me smile. As the granddaughter of a pig farmer, let me tell you, the noise of 2,000 pigs hurtling full speed down a steep bank and falling into a lake and drowning would have reached the town way before any man could have got there. Pigs are noisy. It doesn't take a lot to get them jittered. And when they are, you know about it. But however they'd found out, whether it because they heard it, or whether it was because these out-of-breath people came and said, I don't know whether you've heard, but... The people from the town and the countryside seem very eager to find out what the cause of the commotion was. And what is it that they find? Well, they find this very problem man sitting, fully dressed, and in his right mind. And standing beside him is Jesus. Now, you would imagine at this point, would you not, that they should feel so excited, so utterly delighted, so joyful to discover that this man who has been such a problem for them for so long was now whole. But verse 15 says they were afraid. They were afraid. Doesn't that seem strange? I can imagine they were afraid of him before, when he was crazy and he was sort of out of control, but now? You'd think that they would offer Jesus the freedom of the city, wouldn't you? Instead, they just say, here's a ticket to go. Here's a ticket out of town. I think verse 17 is one of the saddest verses ever to read. Then the people began to plead with Jesus to leave. They plead with him. They don't just say, we'd quite like it if you went. They plead with him. They beg him to go. They beg him to go. Why? Because you see, when Jesus turns up, things changed. Things get changed. Problems they've been powerless to deal with and had ignored. I think it was difficult probably for them to ignore this problem bloke who screams day and night. It was a bit of an uneasy truce, wasn't it, really, when you think about it? We'll chain you up and put you over here, and we'll carry on over here with our lives. Let me tell you, I'm sure they could hear him screaming and going off on one. It was an uneasy truce that they'd come to with him. And the shame of this situation, I think, had been highlighted. Their shame in how they've dealt with it is highlighted here. Because this situation is sorted out and it has altered routines and it's altered traditions. The shame has been dealt with and taken away, but those who own the pigs have paid the price, haven't they? There's a price to be paid for shame to be dealt with and taken away. The owners of the pigs have paid because their livelihood is now at the bottom of the lake. This man's freedom from shame is their loss of privilege. Jesus has the power to break the chains of shame, but it costs. Now, my granddad always used to say on very humid days, he used to tell us that his dad used to say to him, God, it's so close you could touch it. It's so close you could touch it. And we used to go, of course he did. But I think of this, I think of him saying that here because, why? Because here is Jesus in all of his power, bringing wholeness and healing to a man who had terrorized a community for a long time. He is so close to them. The air is humid with the person and the presence and the power of Jesus that they could reach out and touch him, but they choose not to. They're not comfortable with the power of Jesus that was at work in their midst. It's a power they can't understand. It's a power that's cost them. It's a power that's driven them from their comfort zones into uncharted territory, and so they politely beg him to go. And notice Jesus doesn't push himself upon them. He doesn't outstay his welcome. He gets into the boat and he goes. And it's made me wonder whether many of us here can say, probably, do you know what? Within churches, I think we're all right with the person of Jesus. We can identify with the person of Jesus because that's what we celebrate at Christmas. It's one of the greatest celebrations of the Christian year. We celebrate the person of Jesus because he was born like us. He lived a life on earth like us. He went out and partied and drank and laughed. He cried. He grieved. He had problems with his siblings and his mum when they thought he was crazy. You know, he dealt with difficult people. He was a person like us. We don't have a problem relating to the person of Jesus, and I don't think at times we have a problem relating to the presence of Jesus. I'm sure there's times when you and I can probably say, I had a real sense of Jesus' presence with me. Whether it be when we're worshipping together or when you're out walking and for a moment you are stopped dead in your tracks because what you are looking at or is so beautiful that you just get such a sense of Jesus. Or whether it's when you're reading the Bible and there's a verse that jumps out at you and you just get a sense of the presence of Jesus. I don't think we have a problem with relating to the person of Jesus or the presence of Jesus, but the power of Jesus. The power of Jesus. I wonder how keen or ready or easy we find that within our churches to relate to. Huh? The power of Jesus. Because you see, we can't control the power of Jesus. Maybe if we felt we could control it, we wouldn't have so much of a problem with it. We can't fully understand it. And so maybe we don't come quite so readily openly towards the power of Jesus as we do towards the presence and the person of Jesus. Let me tell you, if you this morning have a sense of being bound up by shame, and I'm quite convinced that some of you will, because I think it's quite prevalent in the church, please know this. It's only the power of Jesus Christ that can set you free. And you delude yourselves if you think that you can be set free from it in any other way. Try it. But it won't work. Only the power of Jesus can set you free from shame. The person and the presence and the power of Jesus transforms this hopeless situation, this messy situation of shame. And the story of this transformation, of this journey from shame and isolation to acceptance and purpose becomes this man's story. Because he can now speak of the person and the presence and the power of Jesus. And despite his desire to go with Jesus, which I think is fully understandable, why on earth would you want to stay in that place? After how that community had treated him, why on earth would you say, I'd quite like to stay here? They seem nice people. I'm sure they won't hold anything against me. I'm sure there'll be no sniggering and talking behind cans like this as I walk by. There's that crazy man. How long is this going to last? Do you remember when he, Would you want to stay there? I wouldn't. I always thought it's a bit harsh of Jesus, really. When this man says, can I come with you? And Jesus says, no. I've always thought, really? Hasn't he been through enough? And yet Jesus here does something better. Because he commissions him. He commissions him. I would suggest to you that what we have here is the very first evangelist to the Gentiles, even though the Apostle Paul would like to take that title. He does something better here because he says, I believe in you, you've got purpose and you have abilities and you are able to now go and do something that nobody else can do. You can go and speak and tell people about what's happened to you and about the power of all that has come upon you and changed you and transformed you and freed you. And you know, in Mark 8, when Jesus returns to this region, we read that rather than there just be one crazy man that turns up to welcome him, there are 4,000 people. There is a crowd of 4,000 people because Jesus feeds them. Just think about this story in relation to the parable of the sower in the last chapter and realise that for so many this was a fruitless place, a fruitless situation, and it was as ridiculous as throwing seed on a path. But this encounter with the person and the presence and the power of Jesus bears much fruit. Much fruit. And the person and the presence and the power of Jesus is seen again in this situation of shame as this woman who suffers from bleeding, which would have caused her to be unclean, isolated from the community, from worship, from anything that was going on, who had suffered much under the care of many doctors, who was now poor because she had spent all her money trying to get well. She is a hopeless case. Can't do anything with her, can't cure her, so we'll just push her to the sidelines as well because we can't cope with it because she's too different to us. Shame on her. Isn't it a shame? She manages to elbow her way through the crowd just to touch the robe of Jesus. And at once she feels that she's healed and freed. And yet Jesus then knows power has left him, remarkably. And everybody goes, what are you on about? Everyone's pressing in. But he knows power and presence. But again here we see the personal touch. Because what does he say to her? I've often thought it's a bit unpastoral really to go, who's touched me? As if the poor woman hasn't been through enough. But I think there's a reason for it. Yes, she's physically healed. But shame isn't just about a physical thing. It's a deep emotional thing. And what's the first thing he says to her? Daughter. Daughter. She may have been physically healed, but the shame and the stigma of her condition required an emotional healing. And in calling her daughter, that shame is spoken into, and it is undone, I tell you. It's undone. Because as he calls her daughter, he's saying, do you know what? You are loved, and you are accepted, and you are part of the family, and you are precious, and you are known, and everything that shame has told you you are, I now say, is gone. Who pays the price this time? Well, I suppose you could say it's Jairus' daughter, because her father, the synagogue ruler, who, let's be honest, probably wasn't too keen about Jesus. Like, Jesus was causing a lot of problems for synagogue rulers, because he kept talking about stuff that sort of seemed to like clash with their rules and regulations. I mean, you wouldn't have really wanted Jesus in your patch if you were a synagogue ruler, really. But he's thrown caution to the wind. He's probably brought a bit of shame on himself from his peer group because he's come running and fallen at the feet of Jesus and said, can you come and sort my daughter out? And then we find that because of this delay for this one woman who, you know, what was she? His daughter's died. But you see, although the person and the presence and the power of Jesus has been tested and seen to be trustworthy, we now see that it's also triumphant. Because Jesus speaks words again personally, words that would have connected with a 12-year-old. My little one, get up. Arise, my little one. And she does. The person of Jesus, the presence of Jesus, the power of Jesus, tested, trusted, triumphant. Jesus here confronts impossible and messy life situations that are full of shame, full of hopelessness. And he brings freedom and he brings wholeness. The kingdom of God is near. And this is what it's like. No shame and freedom to live life in all of its fullness. So this morning, do you know shame? Do you know shame? As I was thinking and praying about this before I left home, I was thinking it's very much like that verse in the Oh for 1,000 Tongues to Sing, isn't it? He breaks the power of cancelled sin. That's shame, I think. That we can come to Jesus and we know that we're forgiven. But sometimes we still feel ashamed for the things that we've done. It's the power of cancelled sin. It's shame. Jesus breaks it. He sets the captives free, is how that rest of that verse goes. Because he has the power to break shame. And there's a lot of shame, I think, that is carried with the power of cancelled sin that holds over us, because we remember all of the things that we've done, and every time we do something again, it rears its head and tells us how pathetic we are, how unworthy we are, how rubbish we are. Do you know shame this morning? Because I can say, what I can say to you is this: you don't need to. You don't need to know shame. Come out of your cave, because that's where your shame will have forced you, and elbow your way through the crowd and reach out to touch this Jesus, because he is here this morning. The person and the presence and the power of Jesus is here this morning. And we sometimes know about the person of Jesus. We're sometimes comfortable with the presence of Jesus, but are you comfortable being open to the power of Jesus? Only you can answer those questions, but the person and the presence and the power of Jesus is here for you today. Because he is the only one who can transform you, who can take away your shame, take it far away, deal with it, so that you can be free to live the life that he longs for you to know. Don't go from here without reaching out to touch him today. Don't go from here. And if you want somebody to pray with you, then come and see me, or see somebody that you trust who can pray with you this morning. Because Jesus, the person and the presence and the power of Jesus, is here to meet with you where you're at today. Amen.
And to